Hey, good morning, Ira. It's great to see you again. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.
Perhaps we could just start, if you'd like to just introduce yourself for the audience. And first question I've got is which you'd like to go into, is really to be able to give us a bit of color about 2020. It really was a tumultuous year for the global economy. And perhaps you could just put that into context for us.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm Ira Kalish. I'm the Chief Global Economist for Deloitte, based in Los Angeles. And my job is to advise our leaders and our major clients about what's happening in the global economy and what it means for the business environment. Now, as to your question, you're right. 2020 was a year like no other. Obviously, we had the first really big global pandemic in a century. And this had obviously a devastating impact on the global economy. What's interesting is that because we know more about viruses than we did a century ago, at least so far, this pandemic has not been, in human terms, as bad as the one 100 years ago. But in terms of economic impact, it's been pretty catastrophic. We had a very sharp drop in real GDP in China in the first quarter, and then in most other countries in the second quarter. In both your country and mine, we had the sharpest drop in real GDP in the second quarter ever. And then in the third quarter, the biggest increase in real GDP ever. And then we had an unprecedented degree of government intervention, not so much to stimulate economies, but to protect people and businesses that have been disrupted. So again, in your country and mine and many others, we saw huge increases in government debt, huge increases in spending, unusually aggressive monetary policies with interest rates close to zero and massive asset purchases. So the world today, as a consequence of all of this, is very different than it was a year ago. And perhaps the most important consequence is a dramatic shift in the behavior of consumers and businesses. That's evident by just the fact that you and I are speaking right now on Zoom. People are working from home, they're shopping from home, they're being entertained from home, they're learning from home, they're not traveling very much. And there's a possibility that these changes will persist long after the pandemic is over.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ira. So looking ahead to 2021, having had this tumultuous year in 2020, what do you think are the prospects for global economic growth?
Well, I do think the global economy will grow this year, but in most places only modestly, if only because in the first part of the year, in the current quarter in which we are, we're still seeing in some places either very weak growth or even declines in real GDP. In fact, in both the UK and the US, our expectation is that real GDP will have declined in the first quarter. In your country, largely because of lockdowns necessary to fight the resurgence of the virus. Here in the US, because of the resurgence of the virus, but although we haven't had the kinds of lockdowns that you have over in Europe. But in any event, I think the global economy will be weak until the vaccines are fully distributed. And so the true outcome of the 2021 economy will depend largely on the speed at which countries are able to distribute the vaccine. In some countries, including the UK, we're off to actually a very good start. In many other countries, we're not. But hopefully that will change. And if we can get the vaccine widely distributed by the second half of the year, we can approach herd immunity, in which case, most importantly, we'll see a significant change in the behavior of consumers who will no longer be afraid that the virus is out there and threatening, and that will make them comfortable going out again, interacting socially again, going to venues that involve social interaction, and of course, spending money. At that point, we could actually have a very robust global economy, perhaps by the end of this year.
And looking at Europe as a whole, do you see those same trends, or those trends playing out differently in different geographies within Europe?
Yes. If you had asked me this question 3 months ago, I would have given a very different answer. Because about 3 months ago, Europe had started to see the second wave of the virus, which was pretty catastrophic, but European governments mostly responded appropriately with lockdowns. European consumers changed their mobility and reduced their social interaction. And so by November or late November, we had seen a sharp drop in the number of infections in most European countries. And that kind of set the stage for recovery. I and many other economists at that point believed that once this outbreak was resolved, that in the first quarter of 21, we would see a robust recovery. That's not the case now. Obviously, in December, we started to see the new strain of the virus, first in the UK, and then spreading to many other countries, and then other strains of the virus, which apparently are far more contagious, although not necessarily more deadly than the first strain. And so we saw once again a resurgence in the number of infections and hospitalizations and deaths, and the requirement of different countries to tighten economic conditions and thereby suppress especially consumer spending. Now, there have been differences across Europe. Right now, we're seeing a very severe outbreak in the UK and in Spain, less severe in France and in Germany. But even in those countries, governments have taken precautionary actions which are having a negative impact on economic activity. So my expectation is that across Europe, in both the UK and the European Union, will see a very weak economic situation in the first quarter, particularly weak in the UK, maybe not quite as weak in Germany, but in no part of Europe do I expect to see a strong economy in the first quarter. And then after that, it really depends on two things. It depends on the success in suppressing this new outbreak, and then it depends on the success in distributing the vaccine. The UK is an interesting story in that it has the worst outbreak, but the best distribution of the vaccine, which are two factors that are operating in cross paths. And then if you look at the amount of vaccine distribution in France, it's very poor, but they haven't had quite as bad an outbreak. So my hope is that there will be success in suppressing the spread in the next month or two, and that in the months to come, we'll see a strong distribution of the vaccine so that by the last quarter of this year, most of Europe can be on a very positive path.
So Ira, both governments and the private sector are addressing the climate issue. And what are your perspectives on this?
Well, certainly major governments around the world have set ambitious targets. The European Union, Japan, China, and now the US are all planning to be carbon neutral by sometime in the middle of this century. And many governments intend to completely abandon the gasoline-powered or petrol-powered automobile by sometime in the next decade. So I think we're going to see progress from a government perspective. But what to me is very interesting is how the private sector has already taken the lead on this, and especially the financial sector. Banks, insurance companies, investment companies increasingly are assessing risk, pricing assets, allocating portfolios, at least in part, on the basis of climate risk. And in so doing, they are compelling non-financial companies, including retailers, to change the way they do things and to be more focused on this because there are evidently costs to not doing it. So although I'm quite certain that most companies are doing it in part because they want to do the right thing, it makes sense from an economic perspective as well. So I expect to see a lot take place. And then, as you and I had discussed earlier, consumers increasingly care about this issue and will spend money and shop in part on the basis of whether they believe the products they buy and the services they buy are climate responsible. So I think we'll see a lot happen even in the absence of strong government action.
So now turning to an industry that we know is very close to your heart, Ira, it's retail. With the vaccine rollout, do you think retail is going to bounce back, and when?
Yeah, I do think retail will bounce back, probably in Europe in the second quarter, and maybe grow slowly until there's a fuller distribution of the vaccine, and then it could pick up to a much greater speed. Now, what we have seen during the pandemic is not just a decline in retail sales and then a partial rebound, but a dramatic shift in how people shop. We've seen a huge increase, not just in Europe, but in many parts of the world, huge increase in online shopping. And as a consequence, store-based retailers have been especially disrupted, and especially clothing retailers and department stores, both because people are comfortable shopping for those things online, and because given that nobody's going anywhere, they don't care how they look. So they're not shopping for clothing. Of course, they are shopping for food and household products and pharmaceuticals. And so those types of retailers have actually done reasonably well. But my expectation is that overall retail sales will accelerate in the second half of this year, but that having found that it's really easy to shop online, I think a lot of consumers will continue to do that. And I think by the end of this year, the online share of overall shopping will be much larger than it would otherwise have been absent the pandemic. And that will mean for store-based retailers a lot of stress. And I think we will see the number of store-based retailers in operation lower than would otherwise have been the case. We'll probably have seen some bankruptcies and business failures in the industry. And we'll see for those retailers that remain in shopping centers and on the high street, a necessity for finding a way to generate traffic and make shopping entertaining. You know, there's that old thing about the theater of retail. And if you look at some of the old line department stores like Galeries Lafayette in Paris or Harrods in London or Kadava in Berlin, these are, in a sense, entertainment venues. And they're able to drive traffic, not because people need things, but because they enjoy going. And I think in the future, that's what store-based retailers will have to do, whatever it takes. I mean, it's not just a matter of elegance or being posh. A low-price retailer can be entertaining as well. Here in the US, some of the membership warehouse clubs, which are very basic, are still places people really enjoy going because it's almost like a search for something interesting that they're not sure what it might be, but it's interesting to look nevertheless. So that's sort of what I see for the near-term future for retail.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ira, for joining us this morning. It's been great to see you and really appreciate hearing your insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks for having me.